The shot came from a rooftop across the street in Queens. Not at the king, but at his most trusted man. A message sent in broad daylight. They thought Harlem wouldn't even hear it. The sun was generous that Tuesday. It warmed the brick-faced storefronts of Astoria, Queens, making the ordinary feel safe. Children's voices echoed from a nearby schoolyard, and women carried groceries home, their minds on dinner. This was not Harlem. This was neutral ground, a place where business could be done quietly, where handshakes carried the weight of treaties between kingdoms. Bumpy's man, Junie Bird, walked with the easy confidence of a man backed by an institution. He'd just left a meeting, a simple collection, a confirmation of territory. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't armed for it. His presence alone was supposed to be enough. In Harlem it always was. But here, under a sky that belonged to everyone and no one, the rules were different. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a sharp, clean crack, like a thick branch snapping in a winter freeze. It cut through the afternoon hum, precise and sterile. For a half-second, no one reacted. Then Junie's legs gave way, his knee exploding in a burst of red against the pale concrete. He went down, not with a cry of pain, but a grunt of pure, astonished betrayal. Across the street, on a tar paper rooftop, a man packed a rifle into a long, worn leather case. He didn't rush. He moved with the deliberate calm of a craftsman putting away his tools. The job was done. The message, sent from men who owned the steel and concrete towers of Manhattan, had been delivered to a king they refused to recognize. On the street below, the silence that followed the shot was heavier than the shot itself. The news didn't arrive with a screaming siren or a panicked phone call. It came carried by a man who walked into the back room of the Lenox Lounge without knocking, his face a mask of grim duty. In Harlem, bad news travels on foot. It's a sign of respect, a confirmation that the information is too heavy for a wire. Bumpy Johnson was holding a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the low light of the shaded lamp. He wasn't drinking it. He was just holding it, a centerpiece for the quiet conversation weaving around him. The talk was of business, of rents and percentages, the mundane arithmetic of an empire. When his man entered, the numbers faded from the air. The room fell silent, not because of a command, but out of instinct. The messenger spoke in a low, even tone. "It's Junie. They hit him in Queens. A rifle, from a roof. He's alive. The leg." Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't tighten his grip on the glass. Instead, a profound stillness settled over him. It was a terrifying calm, a void where rage was supposed to be. He placed the scotch on the polished wood of the table, the soft clink the only sound in the room. His gaze went distant, looking past the walls of the lounge, past the Harlem streets, to a rooftop in a borough that had dared to forget its place. This silence was his true language of power. His men understood it better than any shouted order. It was the drawing of a deep, cold breath before a storm. The men in the room didn't move. They didn't ask questions. They simply watched their king. Outside, on the sidewalks of 125th Street, the rhythm began to change. The laughter from the street corners grew a little quieter. The old men playing checkers seemed to pause mid-move. An invisible signal passed through the neighborhood, a tightening in the air. The Italians had fired a bullet. It had traveled 5 miles and struck Junie Bird. But the echo, The deep, resonant shockwave had just arrived here, in this room, and it landed not in a panic, but in a silence that was far more dangerous. Bumpy hadn't spoken a word, yet his first order had already been given. Wait. The clock started the moment the two detectives stepped out of their unmarked Ford onto the blood-stained sidewalk in Queens. The senior man, Detective O'Malley, had seen 3 decades of city crime. He was a man who believed in evidence, in things he could touch. A murder weapon, a dropped hat, a fingerprint on a window pane. His younger partner, Detective Rossi, was ambitious. He saw a high-profile case, a chance to make a name. They found the scene scrubbed clean. Uniformed officers had cordoned off the area, but there was nothing to protect. The bullet casing was gone, likely taken by the shooter. The initial witness, a fruit vendor who had made the first call, now remembered nothing. "A car backfired, maybe," he said, his eyes fixed on a crate of oranges. "I was busy. A lot of noise in the city, you know." They spent the first day knocking on doors. It was a masterclass in collective amnesia. The woman hanging laundry on her fire escape had been looking the other way. The men playing cards on the corner had been too focused on their game. Every face was a polite, impenetrable mask of civic disinterest. Rossi's frustration grew with every slammed door. O'Malley recognized the pattern. This wasn't fear. It was allegiance. They weren't just witnesses. They were soldiers standing guard, and their silence was a fortress. By the second day, the pressure was coming from 2 directions. The precinct captain wanted arrests, headlines. The Mafia families, the ones who had sanctioned the hit, were watching from their social clubs in Little Italy, waiting for Bumpy's inevitable, violent response. They expected bodies. They had lit a fuse and were waiting for the explosion. A war in Harlem would be good for their business. But from Harlem, there was nothing. No threats, no boasts, no gunfire in the night. The silence was unnerving. It felt unnatural, like the dead calm before a hurricane. Back at the precinct, Rossi slammed the case file on his desk. "It's like the whole neighborhood is in on it. How are we supposed to find a ghost?" O'Malley stared out the window, his gaze lost in the city haze. He knew this wasn't the work of a ghost. It was the work of a king who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. While they were chasing shadows in Queens, Bumpy Johnson was letting the city's underworld marinate in anticipation. The 48 hours weren't a deadline for him to find the shooters. They were a grace period he was granting his enemies, a chance for them to contemplate the mistake they had made. The police were a footnote in a story they couldn't even read. Their investigation hadn't just stalled, it had been erased before it even began. 72 hours had passed since the shot. In a dimly lit social club in Little Italy, the air was thick with cigar smoke and impatience. Don Costello, a man whose family had controlled the Queen's docks for 50 years, held court. His soldiers, men with heavy hands and short tempers, waited for the news they all expected. Bodies in a Harlem alley, a car bomb on 7th Avenue, the opening salvos of a war they were certain they would win. They had thrown a rock at the king's window, and the silence in response was starting to feel less like fear and more like a deliberate, condescending insult. The police were just as lost. Detective O'Malley and Detective Rossi had nothing. Their informants had gone deaf. Their leads had turned to mist. They sat in their stale office, 2 men fishing in an empty ocean. Every hour that passed made them look more foolish, more irrelevant. The crime wasn't the shooting anymore. It was the city-wide conspiracy of silence that followed. a silence orchestrated by a man they couldn't touch. The invitation was not delivered by a thug. It was carried by an old man named Mr. Jacob, a tailor who had made Bumpy's suits for 20 years. He was a respected elder in Harlem, a man known for his quiet dignity and steady hands. He walked into Costello's social club alone, wearing a simple but perfectly pressed suit, holding a hat in his hands. He looked like someone's grandfather who had taken a wrong turn. The card players stopped. The laughter died. The bodyguards tensed, hands instinctively moving to their coats. Mr. Jacob walked directly to Costello's table, ignoring the hostile glares. He did not bow his head. He simply stood before the Don, a man who could have him killed with a nod, and waited to be acknowledged. "I have a message for you, Don Costello," Mr. Jacob said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the price of fabric. "It is from Mr. Ellsworth Johnson." Costello leaned forward, intrigued by the audacity. "He sends a tailor to do his talking?" "Mr. Johnson does not need to talk," the old man replied gently. "He wishes to listen. He requests the presence of the two gentlemen who handled the business in Queens. Tomorrow night, at the Red Rooster. He would like to have a word." The room was stunned. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand for tribute or an apology. It was a social invitation. The Red Rooster wasn't some dark warehouse. It was a popular Harlem restaurant. The request was polite, almost corporate. It was so far outside the established rules of underworld diplomacy that it felt like a move from a different game entirely. Costello's men looked to him, expecting him to laugh, to have the old man thrown out. But the Don was silent. He understood the chilling brilliance of the move. To refuse the invitation would be an admission of fear. It would signal to the rest of the city that his men, his snipers, were afraid to have a conversation with their target's employer. To accept was to walk willingly onto Bumpy's home ground, into a trap they couldn't see. Bumpy hadn't responded with violence. He had responded with etiquette. He had taken their act of war and reclassified it as a breach of protocol, a matter to be discussed. In doing so, he seized absolute control of the narrative. He was no longer the victim reacting to an attack. He was the authority, summoning subordinates for a performance review. Mr. Jacob placed a small, embossed card on the table. "He said to tell you they will be his guests. No one will be armed." He then turned and walked out, leaving a silence colder and heavier than any threat could have. The private upstairs room at the Red Rooster was warm and smelled of bourbon and roasted chicken from the kitchen below. There was a single round table set for 5. Bumpy sat, nursing a small glass of water. To his left sat the 2 shooters from Queens. Their names didn't matter. They were tools, and they looked it now. Uncomfortable in their cheap suits, their rooftop arrogance replaced by the cold sweat of men who had accepted an invitation they could not refuse. The other 2 men at the table were unexpected guests, Detective O'Malley and Detective Rossi. They hadn't been summoned by a tailor. Their invitation had come via a phone call to the precinct from a lawyer, suggesting a private, off-the-record conversation that could bring their frustrating case to a close. They had come, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and desperation. Bumpy spoke first, his voice barely above a murmur. "Thank you all for coming." He looked at the 2 shooters. A message was sent. It was received. But it was sloppy, bad for business. It created noise, and it disrespected the peace. He then turned his calm, heavy gaze to the 2 detectives. "And you, gentlemen, you were given the task of cleaning up that noise, but you have found that difficult. The streets are not talking to you. Your file is empty. Rossi shifted in his chair, about to protest, but a look from O'Malley silenced him. The old detective understood. They were not here as law enforcement. They were here as students, receiving a lesson in a power structure they had failed to comprehend. "So, we have a situation," Bumpy continued, steepling his fingers. "We have two men who followed a bad order." He nodded to the shooters. "And we have two men who are unable to do their jobs." He nodded to the cops. "An imbalance." He let the silence hang in the air, a weight on all of them. "Here is how we restore the balance," he said finally. He looked at the shooters. "Your boss, Mr. Costello, he put you in the wind. He will not cover you when the response comes. I am offering you a train ticket, southbound. You will get on it tonight, and you will never set foot in this city again. You will become ghosts. That is my gift to you." Then he looked at O'Malley and Rossi. "And for you, a gift as well. This case goes cold. The leads dry up. The witnesses vanish because they never existed. You file it away, unsolved. You are no longer responsible for it. You are free to work on crimes that you can actually solve." There was no negotiation. There were no threats. It was a simple statement of fact, a decree from the only man in the room with the authority to make it stick. The shooters looked down, their shoulders slumped in relieved defeat. O'Malley gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He understood the terms. He was being allowed to walk away from his own failure. In that room, Bumpy Johnson didn't just command criminals. He commanded reality. He made two men disappear from the underworld and two detectives disappear from a case, all without raising his voice. The next morning, the city woke up unchanged, which in itself was the most profound change of all. The headlines spoke of politics and foreign affairs, not of gangland shootings. In the 108th precinct, a file was quietly moved from an active drawer to a cold case cabinet. The names Rossi and O'Malley were reassigned to a routine burglary. They never spoke of the meeting at the Red Rooster again. Junie Bird returned to Harlem weeks later, walking with a slight limp, a permanent physical record of the insult. He carried it not as a weakness, but as a badge of honor, a symbol of his king's protection. Across the river, in the social clubs of Little Italy, a chill had set in. Don Costello had lost two of his best men, not to bullets, but to a train ticket. His authority had been bled, not with violence, but with a quiet, dismissive act of mercy that felt more insulting than any reprisal. No war came, no bodies dropped. A new understanding settled over the 5 boroughs, an unspoken treaty written in the language of restraint. The power in New York was not just about who held the most guns, but who had the wisdom not to use them. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that true dominance wasn't about winning a fight. It was about making the fight unnecessary. The silence he commanded was his territory, and its borders had just been expanded without a single shot fired in return.